See, professional stuff. You go into an art gallery and
I'm
you expect to
impressed.
see art, and you're
I'm
pulled
impressed.
back into a podcast room. Art Hittner on today. Thank you for coming, Art.
It's my pleasure.
You know, with a name like Art,
Yes.
it's going to be a good podcast, right? It's got to be a good podcast because your name depicts what you do and what you love. Yeah, and how is, so I read, a little bit about you because I've known you for, I don't know, what, maybe 5
7 or 8 years,
It goes
I think,
fast,
yeah.
long time. And I know you have a passion for art, you're a collector and all that, but I don't really know the nitty and the gritty of how you got there. So let's just start. So you grew up on the East Coast in Massachusetts?
No, I grew up in New Jersey.
Same difference, right?
No, it's not the same difference. New Jersey is a place I didn't want to do anything more than just grow up.
Yeah.
I wanted to get out of there as soon as I could.
Did you? When you were growing up, was that right? Did you
Well,
go?
I didn't. I'm sure I didn't know any better. New Jersey, this is in the 1950s and early 60s, I lived in a bedroom community from New York City. And
is that like a suburb or no?
yeah, it's a suburb, but this was the period when suburbs just burgeoned.
Yeah.
And our town, a little town called New Milford, went from population.
That's why I thought it was like Massachusetts. I think I saw New Milford. That seemed to be like one of those
Yes,
towns that should be.
We went from a population of 6,000, I remember this, 6,006 in 1950 to about 20,000 in 1960. So more than tripled population within 10 years.
Yeah.
And during that period, there was no planning, there were no parks, there was just no way to handle it. Nothing even close.
No, yeah.
No. So it was a community where it deserved the moniker bedroom community.
Yeah.
You slept there if you worked in New York.
And is that what
my father worked in New York.
Yeah, what did he do?
He was an electrician.
Oh,
he worked in the union, IBEW 3, and actually for a period of probably a dozen years when I was maybe before my teens and then into my early teens. He took a break from that and he opened up a little hardware store in the town of New Milford. And that was great until the big box stores came in.
Wow.
And so how
long did he do that?
I think he did that about 8 or 10 years.
And so what years would have that been?
I think that would have been probably the mid-50s to the early 60s.
And did he see the writing on the wall, or it just put him out of business?
He saw the writing on the wall. He got out before he was losing money.
Yeah.
But
that's good.
everything changed in retail.
And how did that affect you as a kid growing up? Were you still at home at that point?
Yeah, it didn't affect me at all.
You
I
didn't?
wouldn't have known any better.
Yeah. So you didn't feel the strife at home or anything? Because, opening your own business, making it work, and then saying, hey, this is basically not going to work anymore is a very difficult thing for a person to go through.
I think it probably is, but I don't think it ever got that bad. I think he just realized that he wasn't going to be able to compete price-wise with all the large companies that were coming in and building the big box stores. That was the era when that was happening, and it changed everything.
Did it affect the way you saw how you might want to do life?
No, I think I think I lived a fairly uninvolved existence. I was just a kid growing up in a little town. I didn't know any better. Working hard in high school and had no idea what I wanted to do in life and didn't feel like I had to think about it
He
yet.
didn't say, kid, don't go into the union or don't open your own store, get an education and become a lawyer?
No, but I must say that when I started college, or I think it was actually the summer before my first year of college.
That was Dartmouth, right?
That was Dartmouth, right. The union had a program where you could spend the summers in as an apprentice, or really sub-apprentice, a helper is what the term they used, on a job. And I took them up on it because the pay was incredibly good. And I worked on a skyscraper that was going up in Midtown Manhattan. And I think it was about 40 stories, and it was all unenclosed. And I was assigned to an electrician who was probably in his 60s, and he was laying wire along the perimeter of the unenclosed 40-story.
Right.
I think we were in the mid-30s
Right.
up there. And he was on a ladder, a 6-foot ladder on the edge.
Uh-huh.
And I was scared.
Uh-huh.
And I kept my distance. I was inside a little bit. But the thought of doing that for a living didn't appeal to me very much.
So it did affect you. It affected you not to do this.
It did. I knew I wanted to go to college. I knew I wanted something maybe more on the professional side. And I didn't have the hand skills that my father had. They sort of skipped me. My brother, who's younger, has those skills, which is nice.
And did he go into that field?
No, he went into a profession, but he can also build a house.
Yeah.
I can barely change a light bulb.
So do you think your dad was encouraging you to take that job just so you can kind of see it, or?
No, I think it was a great opportunity to make money for college, and to spend time in New York City, which, even though we lived close to New York City, it wasn't that easy to make the trip in. We actually didn't go in very much.
And when you were working and doing that, would you take any breaks for art to go look at art? Were you interested in art at that point?
I would say at that point in time I had no interest in art.
Right.
My parents said, I don't believe they'd ever taken us to a museum.
And did you have art in your house at all growing up?
We had no art in our house.
Yeah.
My mother painted a little bit for a period of time late in my teens, almost at the point in time where I had left to go to college. She took it up. I think she had maybe done it when she was much younger, before she had kids. But her art and a little bit of the art of her brother was in the house.
Do you know why she took that up?
No, I can't remember ever having a conversation about it.
That'd be an interesting one to have.
Yeah.
What was that creative, spark? Was it, that, or was it boredom or whatever? Kids
I don't know.
leaving? Who knows?
I don't know.
There was two kids, right? You and your.
Right. My brother and I, he's about 4.5 years younger than I am.
Yeah. So you were the first one out.
Yes.
The door.
Yes.
So now, one of the things about you is not just you love art, but you do. I mean, you definitely have a passion for art. But the question is, what's all this about baseball? You've written 2 or 3 baseball books, including one that got an award. And so where did that fall in line? Was your dad a baseball guy? And it's the Sox that you like too, right?
Well, it took a while to get there.
Yeah, okay, because a New Yorker who likes Boston seems rather odd.
At that time, I was a Yankee fan.
Okay.
My father was a casual baseball fan.
Uh-huh.
Nothing special. I think he took me to maybe 1 or 2 games, and that would have been in the old Yankee Stadium. But I developed a very, very early passion, and that's not even a strong enough word, for baseball. I absolutely love baseball. I wanted to play baseball every minute of every day. Back then.
Did you play in high school or junior high or anything like that?
Well, I played Little League. I went out for my freshman team in high school. I was always no-hit, good field. And I was always the shortest guy in the team, so second base seemed to be the place that I needed to go. And I always wanted to be like Bobby Richardson of the New York Yankees, who played during the 60s. I went out for my freshman team in high school, and interestingly enough, 2 kids who were ahead of me, same class, but who were ahead of me in the pecking order on the ball club, each wound up a few years later signing minor league contracts.
Yeah, so they were good.
So they were good, and I was not nearly as good. So I got into a few games, but that was about it.
But you loved it.
But I loved it, and I collected baseball cards, and I played something called Stratomatic Baseball, which was a board game that essentially was a precursor to today's computer games. And I don't mean the graphic ones, but the more statistically oriented games, where was a dice game where you had cards, and each card was keyed to the actual statistics of a particular player, and you would have a team, and you would do this. And I had a cousin who was maybe 11 months younger than I, and we did this together all the time. So baseball pretty much took up
Sounds like
every
fantasy
day.
baseball is what it sounds like.
In a way,
Yeah.
but it isn't based on actual results that are going on
Yeah.
as we go. But it was a fun game, and there may be some people out there who listen or watch this who can remember Stratomatic baseball.
Yeah.
It's still around,
Yeah.
actually. It's a great game.
So I can tell you still like it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
haven't played it in years, but yeah.
So when you collected cards, were you collecting anything as, oh, this is valuable, I want this, or was it, I want the players because I like these players?
That was before anyone cared about value in baseball
I
cards.
see. What years was this?
This was, I think the earliest cards I can remember having were from the mid-50s. I would have only been 7 or 8 years old, maybe a little less. But into the early 60s, that's when I collected baseball cards.
And so when did you quit collecting them?
Oh, probably when I left high school and went to college.
When did you go to the college? What year was that?
I started at Dartmouth in 1967, fall of 67.
Right during the height of the Vietnam War, wasn't it?
Yes.
And so you were in school when Vietnam was going on, so you missed
Absolutely.
that because of schooling?
Yes, and I had to make a decision when we got to senior year. That's when the graduate deferments had been eliminated.
Ooh.
And at that point, you had to decide. You had the choice to take your chances. That was actually my senior year was the first year of the draft lottery.
Oh, wow.
And
Congratulations.
I can.
That was 67?
That was 70 or 71.
Yeah, I thought that was later.
Yeah. At the end of my college career.
Oh, at the end, okay, I
Right.
understand.
And I can still remember those days. We would have sort of parties where we would get together. This was a one-time event,
No, I
a
remember.
first-time event.
I remember my brother, when they did the lottery,
Yeah.
picking it, we were watching to
You-
see if he
you-
was gonna go or not.
You sat by the radio, and we would be there in a fraternity or in a dorm room with a bunch of beers, and the people who got the low numbers were the losers, and they were
Yeah.
going to drink a whole lot more that night
Yeah,
than the
'cause
rest
they
of
were
us.
going to Nam.
I wound up getting a number that was kind of indeterminate. It was I think it was number 95.
Ooh, yeah.
And they had said that they might go to 125 that year.
And this was 71?
This was 71.
So you're finishing up college.
So I'm finishing up college, deciding whether to take some specific action with respect to the military or to take my chances.
Right.
And I chickened out and decided I'd join the reserves, which,
I don't know if that's chickening out. That's
well, it was
making
the right thing to do.
What was
at
making
the
an
time.
informed decision of what was
Right.
going on.
Right.
And, there's other things you could do too. You could say, I'm going to Canada. There's other things too.
We thought about a lot of those things. There was a lot of discussion on campuses those days, and Dartmouth was actually a fairly active place. We had done a good deal of protesting on the campus. It wasn't in a city, of course, so it didn't have the same level of visibility that a lot of other college campuses had during the late 60s and early 70s. But it was a unique era of American history, and we were right in the middle of it.
So you said, okay, 95 is not a good choice. I think
Right.
I'll go ahead and do the reserves. And so how long did you have to do the reserves for?
Well, I signed up for the reserves, and at the same time, not knowing when they would call me, and figuring I would have an active duty commitment of about 6 months, I had to decide on going on. I had decided to go to law school. Not entirely sure why. It just seemed like the next logical thing for me to do without necessarily having a passion. I had an uncle who was a lawyer. But I simply decided that I would apply to law school. I got in, and I hadn't been called by the time it was time to start law school in the fall of 71. So I started law school, and within about 2 months I was called up. And I think it was ultimately in February of 72 that I went to basic training at Fort Dix.
Was this for officer or was this
No,
for?
I was PFC.
Yeah, because you had a college degree at this point too.
That didn't matter,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Right. So, so I endured my few months of basic training,
Right.
and then went back to law school,
Which was Harvard, right?
Which was Harvard, and it was unfortunate that Harvard had changed the way that it set up its curriculum between the time I left and the time I came back. So I had actually done 1.5 year of law school and then left and then came back, and I was hoping that I would get credit for one of the 2 semesters, and then I would just continue and have to do another 2.5 years. But they went to full year courses. They weren't semesterized. There was no halfway point to start up
So you
again.
had to do a half a another semester over?
No, they said, start all over. We'll give you tuition credit.
The whole thing
But you
from
start,
oh my God.
well, I mean, I was only repeating a half a year.
Yeah.
But for those of your listeners who didn't enjoy law school, and I was one of those people, doing an extra half year was, I think, as bad as basic training.
Yeah.
So I did that, and
At any point in that time, did you say, maybe I should just not do this and go a different direction?
I'm not sure that I actively questioned it, but it was something that was always on my mind for years after that.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, what if I
What
had
if,
done
right.
a different direction?
Yeah. But I think in many ways that if my timing had been different, I might have been involved in computers, for example, but it was too early. And if my interest in art had developed sooner, I might have gone that way. I might have gone into art history or something like that.
Right. I can see that for sure.
But none of that.
You were focused.
Happened.
You
So
were
I was
really
focused. I did my law school, did fine, got a job, and stayed in Boston. And I practiced with the same firm for 34 years until I retired about 8 years ago.
Okay, so when you graduated college in 67 and...
Now, high school 67, college 71,
I'm sorry. Yeah,
and
71.
law school 75.
75.
Right.
So you were out in 75. At that point, so you're you're 24 or so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Had you started any interest in art at that point, or still not yet there?
I think my first real interest in art came in a course that I took, I think it was my senior year at Dartmouth, and it was taught by John Wilmerding, who was later to be I believe he was the director of the National Gallery in Washington. Ponytailed, maybe 30s, 40s, absolutely wonderful professor with a real passion for art. And this was a course that I had no confidence in my own abilities, and I didn't know very much about art.
Why did you take that course, by the way?
It was a survey course. I had room in my schedule to take something light and easy and perhaps more fun than other things.
Yeah.
And I was drawn to it. I guess I don't remember exactly why, but I suppose it just seemed like it might be a fun course to take. And it was a large survey course, and it went into issues of, I think it spent a lot of time on more contemporary art. But again, we're now talking about 1970, 71, so contemporary art then was different from contemporary art today.
Yeah, big time.
So I gained a nice appreciation for some of what I guess we might call now modern artists. And that summer, actually, after graduating Dartmouth, I spent on an internship in New York City. And one of the things that I did do a lot is I'd go to the Museum of Modern Art at lunchtime. I think I joined so I could go any day, sit outside or go inside and just enjoy it. And it
that
was fun.
And that was by yourself you would go?
Actually, I was starting to date my wife then, and she was in New York City too, so we would meet for lunch or otherwise and spend some time outside the museum and inside the museum.
And was she into art yet?
Probably no more than I was.
Yeah.
But we both enjoyed it. It was
Yeah.
fun.
So it gave you guys something to do.
It was a start.
Yeah.
It was a start. But I think the thing that got us going a great deal more was when I guess it was probably right around the time I started law school. My wife and I actually married in 1972, so that was shortly after I finished my basic training and such.
Right. Now, a graduate PFC guy, that's
Right,
pretty, I can
right.
see why she'd want to marry.
Yeah, right. And so we're talking 72, and she moved. She was living in New York and working in the advertising industry, and she moved up to Boston, where I would be at Harvard for the next 3 years. And when she came up, she got to know an elderly aunt and uncle that she had in the Boston area. I don't think she'd met them before. Joe and Lillian Spack. They were this wonderful old couple. They were probably in their late 70s, maybe even early 80s by then. They were pretty elderly.
Doesn't seem so old now, though, does it?
No, I'm afraid not. They lived in Brookline, Massachusetts, and they were antique dealers.
Oh, wow.
And they were not major antique dealers, but they'd been in the business for maybe 35 years. So their business involvement with antiques began way earlier. So we're talking in the 30s or 40s.
Right.
They got into it. And it was a completely different world back then.
And they were generalists?
They collected or sold basically American antiques, antique furniture. They had a few paintings. They lived in a little apartment that was not much more than a tenement. It was really kind of a falling apart place.
They definitely were then in the art business.
Yes, right. And it was right across the street from their very modest shop. But in their little rental, they had amazing things, just amazing things. They had beautiful tall case clock. They had wonderful 18th century furniture.
Yeah, they were right in the heart of where you could get that kind of material too.
Yes,
well.
and they had, this is the one that gets me the most. They had a wonderful painting by an artist, a St. Louis artist named Richard E. Miller. He's an impressionist. His work now sells for $250,000. And they had this wonderful, wonderful painting of a woman by her mirror. It was a beautiful painting. We loved it. One day, a couple years after we had first met them, and we'd see them on a regular basis, we went into their house and the painting was missing. And I couldn't believe it. We asked what happened, and they sold it. They probably needed the money by that particular point in time. And we were heartbroken because I loved that painting. I would have loved to have found a way to buy that painting.
Have you looked for it since?
Well, you know where we found it? We found it in Pittsburgh. We were going through the Carnegie Museum, and there it was on the wall in the Carnegie in Pittsburgh. This was a few years later. Beautiful, beautiful work. And kind of found out, I can't recall how, but I believe they sold it. It went upstream. It passed through many dealers' hands. I think they may have sold it for about $18,000.
Yeah.
And ultimately, as I say, it's at least $250,000 painting. And I don't know what the Carnegie paid for it, but
Would that have been your first piece of art if you had bought that?
no, it's funny. They got us started. Peggy's aunt and uncle got us started by giving us as a wedding gift a drop leaf table. It was probably a 19th century drop leaf table. It wasn't a particularly valuable piece, but we had a very small campus apartment, and we didn't have much room, so a drop leaf table was actually a really good idea.
Mhm.
So just seeing the quality of antiques they had and beginning to learn what you had to pay for antique furniture, and this was back then. Sadly, it's true again today.
Probably
But-
similar price.
Right, but back then you could get these pieces for, many cases, less money than you would pay for contemporary furniture.
Mhm.
And that appealed to us. So we began to collect American antique furniture from the 18th to the early 19th century. And with that, seemed logical, I guess, to become interested in some kind of artwork. So
Yeah, you can have something to put over the table, right?
that's right,
All the tables
that's
you
right.
get.
So when you think about room settings in museums in that period, you generally see portraits.
Yeah, that's right.
And so we became interested in portraits, and we bought.
We're talking
We bought a few
18th century
portraits.
kind of
Um,
things.
We're
American
talking
portraits?
American portraits from, I would say, generally the early 19th to about 1840s. And initially, we were drawn to some academic portraiture. We bought a painting that we years later gave to the Hood Museum at Dartmouth. It was a painting by Chester Harding, who was a self-taught but academic artist in the early 1800s, who was a rival of Gilbert Stuart, much lesser known, but a very successful painter.
And would this always be a dual decision, you and your wife, or was it, you guys have rules like, if you love it, get it, if you don't, if I hate it, don't, kind of thing?
Well, that's another matter.
Yeah.
Our collecting has almost always been, she is fairly reluctant to spend the money, and I need to push the envelope, and I need to know how far to push it.
Yeah, she's your
And-
braking system, whether
Yes,
you want
she
it or
is my
not.
braking system, right. So I
Yeah,
would say that with a very few exceptions, I was always obliged to get through the braking system.
Mhm.
There've been a couple situations where she was as excited about a piece as I was.
Yeah.
And I don't think it was a lack of excitement as much as a less of a desire than I to part with the money.
Yeah, she may have come from a different
I think she
background
She
from
did.
the Depression era.
She definitely
Yes,
did.
yeah.
She had a father who was out of work for a number of years, and I think she felt a lot more uncomfortable about spending money.
Yeah, that makes sense. I see
Yeah.
that a lot. It's not, you're not alone
Right.
in this.
So anyway, we were collecting portraits. The academic portraits interested us for a while, but then we became more interested in folk portraits. So we started
What was
to
it
collect
that,
folk
why was
portraits.
that, do you think? That you went from,
You know what I think it is? I have always, and I think you know this about me, I have always been fascinated by the challenge of learning as much as you possibly can about something, whether it be a piece of furniture, a piece of art. I don't like it all handed to me. If all the information is there and there's no more to ferret out, it's not as much fun.
yeah, you like the learning process and the discovery.
That's correct. So for me, it's not just the chase. The chase I love, but it's not just the chase. It's the effort to research and to accumulate as much knowledge as you possibly can. And I've always been interested in things that were less known. So I would tend to prefer a great work by a lesser artist who is less known than a average work by a better artist, even putting aside differences in price. So
And why is that, do you think, that you do that? I mean,
I don't know. I think I've always been a contrarian of
Yeah.
sorts.
is it's part of you to go, okay, I found this artist, it's great, I want to develop and buy all this art because I know it's going to be valuable, or does that really have no bearing and it's just, I'd rather have the best example by this really well heeled artist that nobody knows about?
I think it's more the latter. I don't think we were ever too worried about ultimate value, although it was always a consideration. I never, in these, you called it the braking mechanism with my wife, the discussion always arose as to whether we were throwing money away or we were buying something that would hold its value.
Right.
And for a long time, buying antique furniture seemed to be a no-brainer. It
Right.
seemed, and this was, this was going into the bicentennial around 1976 and
Yeah.
later. Antique American furniture was booming,
Yeah.
and the prices were rising and rising and rising, and our ability to buy it was limited. I wasn't making a great deal of money practicing law, but
What kind
I
of
was
law do you
making.
practice, by the way?
I was. This is extremely narrow focus. I was with a large firm. Ultimately, it was a large firm. It wasn't so large when I joined it, but the firm had a group within it that structured real estate transactions as limited partnerships for the construction of low-income housing, using tax benefits, later tax credits. Essentially, for many, many years, it has been the primary way to generate low-income housing in the United States. So,
So these
these deals are
limited
structured.
partnership forums that you can do so they can get it built, basically.
Yeah, we would represent companies that were called real estate syndicators. They were the middleman. They would structure a transaction. We would negotiate for investors that the syndicator would bring into the deal to provide the financing, the equity financing, and we would negotiate with a general partner who was the developer of the project. So
You kind of acted as a middleman between the general partner and this other middleman?
in effect, we were the structuring agent,
Yeah.
doing all the documentation, doing all the due diligence, making sure that the transaction was viable, that the financing made sense, assessing the risks, then essentially revealing the risks to potential investors, because we were doing, it was a combination of partnership law, securities law, contract law. It was an interesting practice.
And did you represent the person that was bringing the project to you, or the people who are potentially going to be buying
We
this
were
project?
representing indirectly the people who were buying the project, because we were representing directly the companies that would structure the project and go out and find the individuals who would buy it. Initially, it was individuals. Until a tax act changed in 1986, investors, doctors, lawyers, professionals tended to be the primary investors in these tax vehicles because they got tax shelter. They'd have income taxed as high as 60 or 70%, and they would get tax losses, and this made sense. This allowed them to invest the money
Yeah,
for
they
their
get
benefit.
passive income coming in as well.
Correct. So that made a lot of sense. But then after the tax law changed, the individual investor didn't, it didn't make a lot of sense for the individual investor to invest in these things. The incentives were really for corporate investors. So
So your business
later,
model changed at
the
that
business
point, too.
model changed, the way we structured the deals changed. We wound up doing big pools of transactions rather than each individual transaction.
Was it easier or
one-off.
harder once this happened for your business?
It got harder. It got much harder because before, where our syndication clients were packaging deals to be bought by individual investors who had very little individual impact
Right.
on any decisions that were
Right.
being made on
Got
their
it. I see it
behalf.
already. Now you gotta deal with the big
We were
corporations,
now
say,
dealing
we're gonna
with-
run the ship.
Exactly.
Your job is to write the paperwork.
So we were now caught in a vice between the investor corporations with lots of expensive legal talent
Yeah.
and the developers. And it became less and less fun, to be
Yeah. And they
honest.
squeeze your margins as well.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And that was 86, they changed the laws?
I believe it was 86 that changed the laws that created those structural differences. And then there were always little changes in the laws that we would always have to adapt to after that.
And how long did you stay in the profession as a lawyer from that point on, from 86? Another 10 years?
Well, let's see. I finished up in 2009, so it was another 23 years.
Yeah. At that point, when you clearly became less fun, did you go, maybe I should do something else? Did that ever cross your mind?
No, I was, I would say that there were many times in my life where I asked myself, especially after we become much more interested in art and antiques, whether I could maybe switch gears as you did and do something like that. But the reality of that was that I think it would have been extremely hard to accomplish that. I'm not sure I would enjoy selling as much as you do.
Who says I enjoy selling? Maybe it's just a means of an end so I can have more stuff.
Perhaps. But I'll tell you, when we started collecting the art we collect now, which is American painting of the 1930s and the 1940s, when we started that, which was about 20 years ago, we would acquire fairly quickly, but again, my wife made it clear that if you're going to buy, you're going to sell, kind of get rid of some stuff. So
not a bad
I became
concept,
a call it a quasi dealer for a period of maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years, in which we sold some pieces, not always for a profit, because as I tried to explain to my wife Peggy, the things that we were selling were not the best things we bought. They were the things that we kind of wanted to sell.
Yeah.
And as our tastes evolved, I think we became more and more interested in better and better pieces. And it was great to at least have the ability to sell some of the lesser pieces to make room for better things.
And I think it's important for collectors to understand that it's fine to take a loss. You can take that money and put it into something else that you really love, that does something more for you. And I see this on a fairly frequent basis, that you'll have a collector has some things that they paid too much, or just, it wasn't a great choice of what they purchased, but they're so afraid to lose money on their so-called investment, which they should never buy as an investment anyway, that they won't let it go. And you have to let it go.
I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. I think there are times where you have to be realistic, but there are also times where you just forget about the market. If you're buying because you think you're going to make money, you're doing the wrong thing to begin with. I mean, that's a big mistake. And the things that I think over time that we've sold, that we've made the most money on, have had no relationship to the things that we thought would bring the most money.
Yeah, like your American furniture, and let's get back to that. So, So you
yes.
collect all this American furniture, and is there a point where you go, okay, let's cash out on it because we can get some money and do something else, or did you stick with it through the high and the low?
I think it was a little of both. I think we were fortunate that our tastes evolved. We lived in a house where the furniture, the antique furniture, looked good, and then at a point, I guess it was probably in the 80s, we moved to a more contemporary home.
This is in Boston?
This is in a suburb of Boston, yes. So we moved to a more contemporary home, and when we did, we didn't really think that what we had worked as well as it had in the prior house.
Didn't.
And it didn't. And also I think we were getting, frankly, tired of the portraits. And, I'd done a lot of research on the portraits. I'd actually written an article about one particular artist.
Yeah, who was that? I saw that. Who is
Well, there are actually a few that
Yeah.
I've done. This one was an artist named Spencer T Bancroft,
Uh-huh.
who was an itinerant Kentucky and New York State portrait artist in the 1840s, primarily, late 1830s into the 1840s and early 50s. He actually died at age 29, and we had bought a pair of portraits that were signed on the back, Spencer T. Bancroft. They were fantastic portraits. They were just wonderful, and the sitters were identified, and the year, and
These are more kind of folk arty.
yes,
kind
these were actually large folk art companion portraits of a man and his wife. They were young man and his wife.
Mhm.
And so I researched the hell out of these portraits, which led me to researching the hell out of this particular artist, about whom nobody had ever written anything, except maybe one or two lines in an artist's dictionary somewhere. And then I did an article for Antiques Magazine, which they accepted for publication. They sent someone in to take photographs. And then before it was printed, Antiques Magazine had a change of ownership, and they decided they weren't going to do the article. So we had it published instead by Maine Antique Digest, and they did a very nice job with it. I was a little disappointed in that it's a newspaper and not a nice glossy magazine that people keep for years, but nevertheless, it was published. That was the first thing that I think I got published in the art field.
Do you still have those portraits?
No. Among others, we had gotten tired of them, and
You'd done
we
all the
found a
research
way.
and
I'd done the research. There was nothing more.
Yeah.
Didn't mean I didn't still like them,
Yeah.
but they didn't work as well in our new home.
Yeah.
And we decided that maybe something else we should get into, and that applied to the antique furniture too. So we sold a few pieces.
Through dealers or auction or how? Or yourself?
I think it was a combination of auction and dealers. About that time, we were looking more at galleries for art, and we.
When would this have been, by the way? What years?
I guess we're now getting into the late 80s
Okay.
and into the early 90s. And we took a trip, I remember, to New York City. Again, my parents still lived in New Jersey, and we would visit occasionally and sometimes make time to go into New York and to go gallery hopping in New York, which is something you can't do much anymore because most of the galleries have closed, but it was so much fun back then to do. We were introduced, I think it was an ad that was in the back of Antiques Magazine every month for a dealer named Janet Marquesi in, I think it was the Upper East or Upper West Side, New York City. She was a private dealer, basically, but she specialized in art of the Depression era, 30s and into the 1940s. And on one of our trips, just on a lark, we stopped there, and it was a revelation. I mean, this art was just wonderful. It was full of figures,
Action.
robust figures, activity. We're not talking about landscapes or anything inert looking.
We're talking about men on 30th floors building.
Yeah, things like that.
Yeah.
Things like that. It was. I found it really
I
exciting.
see a thread there.
Yes, I found it exciting, and we looked at what she had. We were. I don't think we bought anything from her, but it started a spark, and I think within a year or two, we had bought. I bought a painting at auction that was produced in the 40s and had that look of the art of the WPA.
Yeah.
And we just continued. And now I think we've got a collection of about 40, 45 paintings that many of them are a little too large, but it's funny when you take a look at your collection and you try to figure out what it is, what's the commonality about what you collect.
Right. No, that's a very interesting
And sometimes
thing to do.
it you don't know it when you're doing it, but when you look back and you have what constitutes finally a collection,
Right.
and you look back at the artwork you have, every single work we have with, I think, the exception of one watercolor, every single work has people.
Yeah.
People are the major element, and they are the dominant element in every respect in the painting. Some kind of activity, and it can be urban, it can be rural, but people are in
Humanity is in it.
right, and it gives the painting soul.
Middle class, probably humanity to some extent.
Oh, it's a
Working
mixture.
guys. Yeah,
It's a mixture.
Is it
I
more
mean,
than just working folks? Is it also?
Well, we're dealing with an era that was overwhelmed by the Depression. And so a lot of the artists back then were very sensitive to the plight of the individuals who were not as fortunate as others in the Depression. So there are paintings that depict poor families in the South. There are paintings that depict homeless people in New York City. A lot of the painters back then I would term social realists.
Yeah.
They were basically painting what they
Documenting.
saw,
Yeah.
and it was painful, and they thought people should be aware of it, and so they painted it.
Yeah.
And they painted it with true sensitivity, and the works that came out of that I think are fantastic.
Yeah, Dixon did it 33 to 39 basically, and
Yeah,
they're some of his strongest works. And they were really inspired by Dorothea Lange, who was doing,
right.
you know, White Angel, Red Line, and things like that. And so, I mean, I do like that area a lot. I think it's very strong work. But will you only collect things like that actually fall in that 30s and 40s, or because I've seen things in the 50s, early 60s even that have that same sensibilities?
Yeah, I think as a collector, you need to make choices. You need to define what you're collecting. You can go either way, and there have been many times, because I like art, particularly American art, over a broad range of eras. I love art from the late 19th century all the way up to around 1950.
Or
for the
even in
most
Ed Mel,
part.
because you've had
And even in
big
Ed
issues
Mel,
about
yes.
that before as well.
But I think that if you have to decide that you're either an eclectic collector
Mm-hmm.
or a focused collector. And given my bent for research, I tend to be focused as a personality. So we have generally been able to maintain a focus on just the 30s or 40s. In fact, I would say that of all the paintings in our collection, I'm not sure that there's one that was painted before the 30s, and there may be one that was painted in 1952 based on an experience in 1937.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of figure it fits in. I don't need to be that specific, but
It's what your
but
eye likes.
it's what my eye likes, and it also allows us to maybe not have so many potential purchase decisions to make. The more you're out there and willing to buy, the harder it is to keep yourself from
Focus.
buying it,
Yeah, I
from
see
buying
it.
too much, really.
I don't know if there is a too much, but
My wife would tell you there is.
yeah. I mean, I look at my own collection and what I like to collect, and I am laser focused on some things, like obviously Maynard Dixon. I
Right.
have more than I probably need, but that doesn't stop anything. But I also have, you know, if you look around just in this room, you see Jorge Fix, something modernist from the 60s, Ed Mel's, contemporary things, and Maynard Dixon's. So I think there's room for that, but I also understand being focused. I do think if you focus and really learn what that area is, and as a dealer, I love clients that do that because it makes them informed. They can make easy decisions. And you know, as a dealer, when you get it, you go, Art would love this.
Yeah.
This is going to be right up his alley.
Right.
And it seems to me that it doesn't matter so much who it is that painted it, but what the painting is.
That's true. One thing to note is that the 30s in particular were a wonderful, wonderful period for the development of prints. And there are wonderful prints that are out there, and you can focus on the 30s and build a spectacular collection of prints. And while we're drawn to prints, and a lot of prints were made by the same artists who did our paintings, we have tried very, very hard to put on the brakes and not buy prints, because we know that the minute we open our collection to prints, we're out of control again.
Yeah.
So I try to have discipline as a collector. I think it's important for a lot of reasons. I think certainly financially it's important, but also if you want a focused collection, if you want a meaningful collection that is important within a range that's narrower, it's easier to do that in a narrower range than it is to have an eclectic collection that is important, unless you have enormous amounts of money.
So if the financial breaks were gone, you win that lotto, whatever,
Yeah.
would that change the way you approach things, you think?
Yeah, I think it probably would. I think I would be more inclined to buy beautiful things that I like outside the period that I focused on.
So the financial constraints really are a large component of how you gear your collection, because you want the best you can have, and to do that requires financial restraints, financially
Discipline, yes.
Yeah, discipline's the right word.
I think an interesting example came out a few days ago. As you know, I've been researching our collection for 20 years, and I've accumulated a great deal of information about each of the artists and pieces of art that we have acquired.
Which you can find online too. You just put
which I just put online.
Yeah, give them the website so they can go visit it.
It's called paintingtheamericanscene.com. And American scene is a term used for the paintings of the 30s and 40s that focused on American subjects. It was a reaction, I think, to the European artists who were gaining increasing prominence during the 30s and 40s.
There was a problem with those artists too.
And it was, yes, it was. And the American artists were, the ones we collect, the ones who were deemed the American scene artists, were more traditional. They were representational. I mean, some of them are much more modernist in look, so I don't mean slavishly representational, but they were clearly not abstract. And they were, and again, we were coming out of an era of the Depression where people had to look inward, and they had to kind of find reasons to gain strength. So the artists of this period, the dominant artists of this period, were certainly not the abstract artists who were beginning to develop a new vision, but it was these representational, traditional artists who saw on an urban street or on a farm, they saw basically what they thought America was. And so they painted those subjects, and they were proud of painting those subjects. And again, it was the more conservative painting philosophy of the time, but it was clearly the most dominant one of the time. And those artists as well, there was no market for art in the 1930s.
Yeah, that's true.
These artists were painting what they thought was important. Some of them, probably at least half of the artists, maybe a little less than half of the artists in our collection, spent a lot of time working for the federal government under the WPA programs in the 1930s. That was the only way they could make a living. You couldn't, there were no dealers. There were a few, but very, very few dealers out there because nobody had the money to buy anymore.
It was just crazy. I mean,
so
Dixon, and between October of 24 and 29, when the crash happened,
Right.
till 1935, probably sold 12 paintings.
Yeah.
And he got a PWPA, which is a precursor to WPA, in 1934, and did a deal. And he was doing murals. He was working on those. But yeah, there wasn't any money.
There wasn't any money, and it's interesting. Let me give you an example. One of the artists in our collection is a man named Leon Bible, and it's Bibel. And you can look at the webpage for him on our paintingtheamericanscene.com website just to get an idea of what this is. This is a non-commercial website for educational purposes
Yeah,
only.
that's right. It is. It's a nice website. I looked at it.
But what's interesting about Bible is that he was an immigrant from Poland, and I think he settled in California initially, and he learned to paint by working with some of the Mexican muralists on projects out in San Francisco. And then he came to New York, and he couldn't make money with his art, and he was employed by the WPA and got involved in their print division. There was a group that actually did some very innovative work in prints and silk screens, and they moved the development of prints substantially during that era and under the aegis of the federal government. But he did a number of prints for the WPA. And then all the time he was painting works on his own. And we're talking the mid-30s. But he wasn't selling these works. He was painting them and he was storing them.
Yeah, you want to be creative.
So he did some absolutely wonderful paintings. He was a social realist too, so his paintings are very strong and powerful paintings, and a lot of them have an extremely powerful social message. But what happened to him was that when the WPA programs kind of ran dry in the late 30s and early 40s, and then the war came, he could no longer make a living as an artist. With the WPA, you had a basic living wage. It was a minimal living wage, but you got paid a certain amount of money a month. It might have been $30 some odd a month, depended upon where you were. But it was enough for some of these artists to live on. But it wasn't enough. You couldn't make a living in the late 30s if you didn't have the WPA paycheck. So what this artist did was he gave up art and he moved his wife to New Jersey, and they started up a farm. And he had hens and chickens. He became a chicken farmer. He had no experience as a chicken farmer, but he decided he could make more money selling chickens than he could painting. But he still kept those paintings, and he may have done a few more, but he focused on being a chicken farmer. And then I guess it was probably in the 70s or 80s when he was very old. Suddenly, people became interested in his story. Somebody found his work. A dealer in Brooklyn actually found his work. And he was still alive at the time, and all these paintings were dug out of his chicken coops. And we bought one. Actually, what we bought was, we bought a painting initially by this artist that was a courtroom painting. You were inside a courtroom and you had the judge on the bench asleep. You had a ticker tape in the background, sort of indicating the influence of money. You had policemen in the back obtaining graft from others. You had lawyers on the bench engaged in some kind of inappropriate activity. So this was his view of the justice system in the 30s. He was a communist at the time. And this painting, I think, was entitled "And Justice for All." So, yeah, I'm a lawyer, so I bought this painting. And it was a good-sized painting, and I was fascinated by it. We got it home, and I looked at this painting, and this is where that question arose, where you worry about an exit strategy, an ultimate exit strategy with respect to art you buy. Was this painting so difficult or so negative that you'd never find a buyer for it if you wanted to at some point in the future? And we thought about it a little bit, and we decided maybe it's a little bit too much. And we actually exchanged it for another work by the same artist, which is called "Building a Nation." And it's kind of a mural style work showing workmen carrying big beams and pieces of lumber in the process. Well, it wasn't a 30th. It was actually a rural scene.
Okay.
It was a little farmhouse in the background, but it's a wonderful painting, and I'm told now by the dealer who's become the specialist in Leon Bible that it may be one of his very best. So I'm glad that we made that switch. But
No
this
regrets
is-
of not having both of them?
the other one came up for auction a few years later, or a few years ago, and I thought about it for a while, but no, we didn't. we
Did it
didn't
sell for
acquire
more or less
It
than,
sold for less.
than what you paid?
It's,
Yeah.
yes, so I guess I maybe made the right decision financially on that one. But anyway, I think the artists of this period, though, are fascinating in that regard. And it's also, people think that it's easy to find works from the 30s and 40s,
No, it's
but
not.
it isn't.
No.
And there are a number of reasons for that. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think certainly one of the reasons is that a lot of artists were not painting that much back then because they couldn't sell their work.
That's right.
A lot of them were painting for the WPA, which means the work went into the federal government and they didn't own it. And I think also we're still at a point where every now and then the estate of one of these artists opens up for the first time after his death or after the death of his children. And suddenly they find this cache of wonderful old paintings that hasn't seen the light of day for years.
Mm-hmm.
It's surprising that this still happens, but it does. And I guess the collector's dream is to be there at the right time.
You are to find the cash.
Right.
And how has that market changed, let's say, since 2008? Has it gone up, down, or kind of sideways?
I think it's probably sideways.
Yeah, I would say that's right.
Yeah.
There's something about those works that, regardless of changes in taste and things, seem to have ring true, I think, for people finding a resonance in that.
Yeah, I think, and again, we've never focused on feeling that we needed to be in the vanguard of what was hot. Modernism is very hot now, and some of our paintings might be deemed on the edge of modernism.
Yeah, I would think so.
But for the most part, we haven't been too concerned about it, and we also, and I guess I was beginning to move along to tell you about a recent experience
Go back to that. Yeah.
when I put the website up and I notified a number of collectors and dealers, people with whom I've had involvement in the arts over the years. And a dealer in New York, who shall remain unnamed, from whom I've never been able to afford to purchase anything, sent me an email telling me that she admired the collection, but that I needed something really special. And so she offered me a Reginald Marsh painting for $200,000. And I politely declined. But the point I'm making is that it's never been my goal as a collector to have that $200,000 artwork, unless I can get it for 20 grand, I suppose. But my goal has always been to get really interesting, fine works by any artists who were viable in the period. Generally, I like to know that the artist has a body of work that is meaningful, and that the particular piece I'm buying is about the best that he's done. But I don't care if no one has ever heard of them. And it's troubling sometimes when people find out you're a collector and they ask you, well, who do you have paintings by? Nobody's going to know the artists that I have paintings by. Mm-hmm. We recently acquired a Reginald Marsh, which is not a major one. It's a watercolor work, a very nice one, but that's probably the only name that anyone would recognize unless they are deeply involved in American art. And I think even as we've collected and we've we met with curators, even curators who have a great deal of knowledge about the period we collect in. They've come in and they've seen our art and they've really enjoyed seeing it, but they haven't been familiar with 2/3 of the artists that we have in our collection. But that's what really appeals to me, because I can add value. I don't mean necessarily monetary, although there can be some value added that way with research, but I can add value overall in terms of unlocking a little bit of the history of the artists that we have. These people were professional artists for their careers. They made a living, ultimately. They probably didn't make a good living, but they made a living. And in fact, some of them were among the leading artists of their day. And because abstract expressionism has eclipsed the art that preceded it, people don't know anything about these people. One of our artists, we have two major paintings by James Chapin. Chapin had 28, I think, one-man exhibitions during his career. And in I think it was 1940 or 42, a retrospective was done in New York of his work, and it was covered in all the major publications, and a painting that we own was reproduced in Time magazine that was discussing that particular show. And the New York Times critics said that he is the leading painter in the country today. Now, who's heard of James Chapin today? Nobody has. But
well, maybe they will now, though.
Well, perhaps.
You know? No, that's right.
Tastes change. Things that are popular now, historic art that's popular now.
Yeah, like our vinyl records, which we never called vinyl.
Yeah, I mean, things do change. But I'm not sitting here holding my breath.
No,
waiting
that's not
for
what you collect.
Right.
And what that
right.
dealer didn't understand in New York was everything was already special.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. I didn't feel a need to spend my next $200,000 if it was there.
Yeah, not when you're enjoying what you
No,
have, and it's, that's what you do. I mean,
Right.
Well, that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, Art. We've already gone over an hour, believe it or not. That's how fast it
good.
goes here. But you are a true collector. I mean, you embody what I think a collector should embody, is that you educate yourself, you love what you do, you're always looking for that next piece or that next artist to educate yourself. And you take it seriously. And you put your money where your mouth is, and you keep your material, and you share. A lot of people forget that component of it, and it's important to share with your website. You're
I think so,
giving back, and you loan things. You had an exhibit for your work at the Museum of Northern Arizona, correct?
Correct.
So, and you've done all those things, and I applaud you for doing that. And I hope some of the collectors out there who are listening, or maybe soon to be collectors, can follow this guy's example. Maybe not 40 years as a lawyer, figure it out a little earlier than that, so you can have more art. And I know you would have if you could have.
Yes, I think you're right about that.
I know I am. Because you have that want to collect and to educate, and you love it. You clearly love it. You do.
Yeah. Stop me if we're running over too much, but let me
There is
tell
no
you.
running over.
Okay, let me tell you one story that I think maybe your listeners will find interesting, and I think it's been one of my most satisfying experiences in the collecting field. We bought a painting. I think it was maybe 10, 12 years ago, by an artist named Harold Rabinovitz. Rabinovitz. This was something that I had actually seen a painting offered by a dealer by Rabinovitz online, and I liked it a lot, but I was too late, and it happens to collectors all the time. And ultimately, the dealer had found another work. Because of his advertisement, another Rabinovitz work came out of the woodwork, and he bought it, and he made it available to me, at least initially. And this was a 5-foot painting, about 5 feet by 2.5 feet. And it pictured a young mother grasping an infant child. The child's naked. And the child is, she's crouching, and the child is looking out behind her shoulder at the child's father, who is carrying a lunch pail, and he's walking home from a day in the fields. It's not clear. It's a rural picture. You can see some mountains in the background, so it might have been a farming area. It might have been a mine. I don't know. But you see a little bit of the interior of the cabin they live in. It's obviously a poor rural family, but it's a Madonna-like picture. It's a beautiful picture. And I was totally taken by this picture. Had to have it. It was going to be expensive. It was going to be among the most expensive pieces we'd bought. And it was by an artist I had never heard of. And you couldn't find anything in the literature about this artist, maybe a mention here or there, because he did show during a brief period. Well, let me step back a little bit. The painting was dated 1936. And the artist, it turns out, Harold Rabinovitz, born in 1915 and came from a fairly well-to-do family in Springfield, Massachusetts. His father was a local doctor, and his Jewish family, and they were able to send him to Yale. He got a BFA, I guess, at Yale in 1935, and he painted this right out of Yale.
He's 21 when he painted.
He's 21 years old. In fact, on his 21st birthday, January of 1936, this painting was exhibited at the Springfield, Massachusetts Art League, which is a regional annual exhibition, much more important then than you might have imagined. And the judges for this particular exhibition were Edward Hopper and 2 other major painters whose names you probably wouldn't recognize, but who were major at the time, a New York and a Philadelphia painter. And this particular painter won first prize. This painting won first prize. And so this artist, again, how can you have such a fantastic painting by an artist you'd never heard of? You got to know that I had to know why. I had to know what the story was.
Yeah, and where's the rest of them?
Where's the rest of it? What's this all about? So I started to look into it. By strange coincidence.
Before or after you bought the painting?
Sometimes I do this usually after I buy the painting. I probably shouldn't, but you don't want to invest yourself before you're able to buy something, because you may not be able to get it.
Yeah.
But I was able to find the painter died in 1944. He died in World War II.
Yeah.
He was only 29 years old,
Yeah.
so that explains a lot of why he's not known. But and that bare fact I did know. But I found a niece of the painter who lives in Tucson.
Oh, that's interesting.
And actually the dealer I bought the painting from is in Tucson. We were not in Tucson when we bought the painting. We had no reason to imagine we'd ever live in Tucson.
Right.
But in fact, the painting went to Massachusetts, and now we're in Tucson, and it came back to Tucson. But anyway, this woman was a niece of the artist, and I contacted her. And what was most interesting is that she had a scrapbook, a family scrapbook that had passed down to her that contained probably 25 or 30 newspaper clippings from Springfield newspapers, New York City newspapers, and photographs of the artist, of some of his works. It also contained some incredible things, such as the original postcard that the artist sent from the Philippines when in World War II, and he did go into the Army in 1941 when he was only 25 years old. At the time, he was a practicing artist in New York City, but he joined the Army and he was sent to Bataan, and he was captured in the first few weeks of the war, and he was in a Japanese prison camp, and they allowed you, under those circumstances, to send a little postcard to your family back home that would indicate that you're well. It would be censored, so anything more than the minimum was not allowed, and I think you had 50-word max. But these postcards are in that in that scrapbook,
From Bataan and
they
from
were
the Philippines.
from the Philippines, and they were just really fascinating from a prison camp. So so I borrowed this scrapbook, and wow, what a cache of wonderful stuff.
Right.
And I couldn't let it go. So I was able to locate the niece's brother, who was in Connecticut, and the other side of the family, there was another niece and nephew. So basically 4 nieces and nephews who were the survivors of this artist who had never married. And, they were all my age, roughly. And each of them has a collection of probably a quarter of the output of Rabinowitz's work. Now, there are maybe 1.5 to 24 paintings and prints by Rabinowitz in the Springfield, Massachusetts Art Museum, things that were given by local people who had bought them during their lifetimes. But so between the Springfield Art Museum and these 4 private collections, it represents most of the extant work of the artist.
Did you end up getting any more of his work?
I didn't. I tried on a few occasions, but the best ones are in the museums and one private collection in Connecticut where, and this saddens me in some ways, this person happens to be he's a very nice individual, and we met him and saw his collection, but his collection is all in storage. He's a folk art collector, so his folk art collection is all over the house, and he's one of the leading folk art collectors in the country. But his collection of his uncle's work is all boxed and kept in the attic. I visited him. He took them all down. He actually had a professional photographer take photos for
that
me.
was good.
And another nephew in Florida had a bunch, and he sent me photos, and there were a few left in Tucson, although the niece in Tucson had sold a number of hers through a dealer here. And then there was a 4th collection in New Jersey, another niece, who was very difficult. It took me 3 or 4 years to finally get her to be willing to show me what she had. And one day we visited her, and she took it all out. And I wound up getting photographs of all of the work. I pieced together a biography from the clippings. And it turns out that this artist had a career from when he painted our painting in 1936 while he was still in Springfield to 1941 when he joined the Army. And he went in 37. It was a 5-year career. He went in 1937 to New York to make his way.
Mark,
And in New York, he lived in the 14th Street area.
And did you do a book or a
And I did a
manuscript?
book. I did a catalog raisonné.
And is
actually,
that printed out?
I self-published it because
So can people find that on your website?
they can find that on Amazon, or they can find it on my website, which is hitnerbooks.com. Hittne.
And I would recommend people to go there because we don't have time to go into the details, at least maybe on this podcast, but he's written a couple great books on baseball as well as a murder mystery that takes place in that same kind of 30s, 40s.
Well, it's not a murder mystery. You're the guy
Crime,
who does the
sorry.
murder mysteries.
Crime.
But actually, the last element of the story on Rabinowitz was that recognizing that no one really would still be interested in a monograph and catalog raisonné on a painter that nobody still has ever heard of.
Yeah.
And I think 9 copies have been sold.
We'll up that. Don't
Yeah,
worry.
maybe get to 10. I thought that it would be a great deal of fun to fictionalize what I knew of his life.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a fictional account of a life of an artist based on Rabinovitz,
Yeah.
based loosely on Rabinovitz.
And the title of the book is?
And the title of that is Artist, Soldier, Lover, Muse. You've sold some copies here. And
We've got good reviews from people that have read it, by the way.
that was a lot of fun. And the reason for doing that was that more people could actually enjoy the story.
Yeah.
It wasn't a totally obscure thing. It was something that was, I think, of more general interest.
Yeah. There you have it.
All right.
We have Rabinowitz. We can get a actual copy of his book on Art's website, or you can also get his new novel, which is based on Rabinowitz, loosely based, but it sounds fantastic. So I guarantee you we'll sell at least one, even if it's just to me.
That sounds great. And I would mention to listeners who are in the Tucson area that I will be doing a reading from the novel at the University of Arizona Art Museum on Sunday, December 2nd at 1 p.m. And at that time...
hopefully this podcast will be out by then.
that would be nice. If it's
So
not.
even if it isn't, whatever, if you'll put that YouTube video, maybe you can get it video and you can put it up on your website and people can see it as well.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
So thank you, Art, for
Thank
coming
you.
and talking.
Thank you.
And I'm going to see if you'll get me a Rabinowitz photo, so we'll put it on this YouTube video as well.
Sure.
Great. Art Hittner, Art
Okay.
Dealer Diaries.
Great.
Real collector. Thanks.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
And Gallery, located for over 26 years in Tucson, Arizona, specializing in antique Native American art, early Western art, including the famed Maynard Dixon, as well as modern art. You can find everything online at medicinemangallery.com. There's over 6,000 objects to select from. Also, the Charles Bloom Murder Mystery Series, written by yours truly, me, Mark Sublette. There's 6 books in this series, and they follow the protagonist Charles Bloom through all the intrigue of the art world set in Santa Fe and the Navajo Nation. These can be found on Audible, ebooks, Amazon, and of course, the gallery at medicinemangallery.com.